Hey everybody, welcome to the third part of our three-parter on AI direction for Ember Sword. As always, I'm Svetlin, your, I guess, not so humble man who tries to drive the conversation. And we yet again have Loren, our executive producer. And this time, the topic is going to be dynamic adventures. Now Loren, what does dynamic adventures mean?
Right. So, let's just maybe start with defining what dynamic adventures are not.
Okay.
Because that'll be easier, right? We've had this conversation a million times, right?
Oh
How
yeah.
much we love getting into like a game and, have the start of our epic adventure be to collect 10 pelts off of these, wolves, or collect 5 candles or 10 poison glands off of the spiders.
It's humble
Um,
beginnings though.
Admittedly, maybe it's just a part of a kind of a hazing ritual that any MMO player has to go through.
I suffered
But
through this, now you will.
yes, exactly. Back in my day, when we got into MMOs, we also had to grind for 30 hours before we got to any meaningful content. So I'm sure as hell going to make you suffer through the same suffering that I had to go
My
through.
56k modem didn't die, so you can have easy adventuring, you bitch.
Right, exactly. So that is absolutely not something that I think anyone would describe as a dynamic adventure,
Absolutely not.
and in fact, is probably more one of the sources of frustration, and. When I think of dynamic adventures, oddly, I don't typically think of MMOs, again, because, they're not very dynamic, but I tend to think of, like plain old tabletop, Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, hell yeah, my
Uh,
man.
those types of adventures, and I know you, Svetlin, you obviously.
I'm very big on D&D. If any of y'all are in the Discord, and you should be, ping me. I'll tell you all kinds of insane D&D stories. You want to know when to not touch a stone that will destroy the world? I know.
Yeah, exactly, and that kind of, that immediately brings me sort of to a core point, right? Like the way D&D can offer such great experiences without awesome 4K graphics and and a dev team that burned through millions to make you an amazing game experience is largely because of that human factor and the human imagination it brings to the table, and that role of the game master that is trying to make the experience meaningful and awesome for everyone around the table.
Yeah.
And sort of essentially our AI director, specifically on the point of dynamic adventures, was kind of like bringing an AI game master into your experience at the kind of quest and adventure level, right?
Right.
So kind of bring you that experience that previously you would kind of need a human game master to have,
Mm-hmm.
where you're going like as a group of players or as an individual, you're going through quests and adventures that actually have meaningful decisions that affect the storyline of what's going to happen. And those don't even need to be such massive decisions. Just think of taking the relic off the altar while you were told not to, or maybe the other way around, the typical Aladdin and the lamp versus the treasure experience, where it's like you can take only the lamp but don't touch the treasure. And then
Right.
undoubtedly one of your players, and then this is one of those really interesting things, if you can accomplish them, right? As a game master, you can then say, hey, you spot like this amazing sword, right? That's lying around in the treasure room, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as the game master, there is one guy in your team, who is just going to want that sword. And damn the consequences, right? and he's gonna mess up the team, right? And that's interesting. You get these very interesting experiences where it's a trade-off between what an individual player in the party wants and what's good for the party as a whole, and that decision suddenly unleashes hell upon them, and has really significant consequences. And those are kind of the dynamic adventures we would like to send players on.
So essentially, the dynamic adventures are experiences that feel curated but are generated by the game, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Yeah, pretty much exactly like that. something that feels like it's curated, that feels like it was made to size for you, that feels like there was someone watching who clearly understood what interesting triggers to provide for you to have a great experience.
So how would we go about the minutia of this? Because I've been thinking about this a decent bit. Say you bring up that example with the sword. Is there going to be like flavor text that is attached to that particular encounter? Is there going to be something extra to add on to the experience to make it feel even more unique in those instances?
Yeah, so I think probably a good way to look at that is kind of going from where the original, I would even say, sort of notion comes from for me, which is way back when. Is like I had the pleasure of working on the world's first MMO FPS, which was called Neocron.
Oh God, Neocron, you guys are in for a treat.
Yeah, exactly. And Neocron, for a period of time, I led sort of the GM team there, and eventually, this was early days of the MMO era. Sort of, EverQuest was the leading MMO out there, and we had quite a sizable game master team, about 25, 30 people, a lot of Valve volunteers in there, and and I think one of the unique things we really did there was organize really great sort of events. And now, obviously, that was always held back by the fact that it was people powered, and you can only entertain so much out of. I think at that point in our peak or something, we had like 30,000 paying subscribers or 35,000 paying subscribers. So there's only so many of those you can entertain as a GM, but. This is, I think, kind of where that idea was born. And I mean, we're talking like almost 2 decades ago or something, right? Where, that was an MMO that was still very much built in, initially in someone's garage and then scaled up to a full-on company and got published by CDV. And, the engine wasn't exactly fantastic. The server technology, was zone-based and with loading in between zones and an individual server dedicated to a zone, and if more than like 300 people would stack up in an individual zone, they would pretty much crash the zone, and then everyone would be stuck in sinking hell for who knows how long, and then kind of load back in and try really hard to get to the zone boundary before they synced out again, right? So you kind of saw people appearing out of thin air, walking 3 steps towards the exit, disappearing, and doing that over and over again to make their way out. Anyway, all jokes on olden MMO technology aside, I did not build the technology stack for Neocron. I mostly helped them find some really horrible issues with it. Including one brilliant one where literally you could send like the I did damage to an enemy player command to the server, along with like some infinitely large number and the list of every single player in the zone, and they would just instantly die, all of them.
Solid, fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. But yeah, so barring those are like side stories for another podcast, I think. But the thing that was really interesting is included in Neocron, initially mostly for debugging purposes and development purposes, was a massive list of commands that would allow you to spawn every creature in the game, and even take the shape of any creature in the game, and a lot of other cool stuff like that. And the thing is, they left in an ability to also make little script files that would execute a whole bunch of commands in a row. And me being the techie that I was, I basically ended up building like complete scripts that would spawn particularly interesting combinations of enemies, items, gear, stuff. Even sending messages out to players in the vicinity. And we basically ended up building sort of a D&D type storylines with large groups of players in that format. And it took a lot of human work. There was a lot of invisible game masters floating about, spawning stuff and doing things to make things happen. But we literally organized invasions of particular segments of the city, or the outside zones, and basically worked all the way through the storyline with people, and doing that all manually, but the best way we could, at least using scripts to kind of make you capable of doing things 10, 20 times faster. And this is kind of where I think that notion grew, and ever since I've kind of been tinkering away when I was involved with these types of MMO projects at systems that do this on scale without any, shall we say, GM involvement, rather being sort of the AI game master. I remember back in the day, I co-founded Chaos War, which unfortunately never sort of saw the light of day. But that was also an MMO, and there, for example, we were integrating this too. So we were integrating this in such a way, for example, that there was in zones outside of one of the main cities, huge conflicts would erupt, and actual drop ships would land in the city to pick up players and take them to the battle, and there would be emergency broadcasts going on that there was an invasion happening there, and things like that. Exactly. And these things, these experiences would typically scale from, like, when you do it with AI, right? It can scale from an individual to a group of 4 or 5, all the way to like freaking hundreds of players. Which is really unique. Obviously, in Neocron we could typically only do it for very large groups because we were trying to give as many people a great experience as possible. But the few times that we did it with small groups was also really amazing. Like, we organized sort of these adventures, for example, for like just pre-release. We organized one of these adventures for the press. We actually took them on like a whole adventure through the Neocron world, and there were like that was literally sort of a party of maybe 7 to 10 people, getting a whole custom adventure in that way. And cool. So it was kind of that led to, and like I said, this is almost 2 decades ago, but that led to me starting to develop further this notion of AI-based dynamic adventures. And of course, in Ember Sword, we are taking that to a much further extreme, because in Neocron, right, there were some things that we could do that were kind of cool, right? Like, for example, there were objects in the world that we could also spawn, so we could place like a chest with some contents in it, etc. But that was kind of where our leeway to create stories stopped. So it wasn't like we could create a base in the middle of the wastelands, let's say, right? We just couldn't spawn that kind of stuff. And what we're doing, and even I would say with something like Chaos War, the technology we were using at the time was maybe not as dynamic that we would be able to do that same thing, like create a camp out of nowhere, for example.
Yeah.
And with Ember Sword, also partially because of the decisions we've taken on the tech side and keeping it super accessible and lightweight, so that you can actually load it straight up in a browser, things like that. It means that we had to use a lot of clever dynamic technology, which also means that, and hell, we even have, player-owned land where you can, put down your own buildings and such. So obviously, all of our content that we're planting in the world is potentially dynamic. So there suddenly we can go a lot further. We could literally generate a complete city out of thin air in our game world if we had to, right? And that is something that we're sort of tapping into for like these dynamic adventures, right? So what we're trying to do there is actually sort of, the next level after the challenge matching, whereas the challenge matching is more like on an epic engagement level, and is like bringing on interesting stuff from outside the screen to have combat, for example, be really cool.
Right.
Here,
it's mostly affecting the moment-to-moment player experience.
Yeah, exactly. Like we've got sort of like I would say almost three levels to it, right? You've got what is essentially your cinematic combat that affects what's exactly on your screen. Then you've got the challenge matching that we talked about in the last podcast, which affects what happens right outside of your screen. And then we've got essentially dynamic adventures, and that kind of affects what goes on in the world, if you will, right? Yeah. So what dynamic adventures are all about is our AI game master looking at like this group of 5 players and thinking, wow, they've been going through this forest for a while now. We should organize something really interesting for them. And what happens is, it'll spawn like an NPC that'll come running towards them, that'll say, hey, help, my caravan has been ambushed. My family's locked down, my wife's locked down there, you gotta help us, right? And hence you go on that adventure. You choose to accept that quest, but it's not, a quest from some rando quest giver that's just standing, straight in the middle of town with a big exclamation mark over his head, waiting for you to trigger him. No, it's something that we have created specifically for your group. And when I say we, I of course mean the AI Game Master, right? So the AI Game Master knows you're with 5 players. You are at this kind of a level, right? And thus it can create an experience that will be particularly interesting, with enemies that are of the right level, with challenges that are of the right level. Like literally to the extent, I'll name a simple example. Let's say you have to go, as part of some quest that is dynamically generated, you have to find the mouth of this huge like cavernous system where you have to go in, and there's an item you must retrieve in order to save someone, right? From maybe some horrible disease they've fallen into, and the only cure is there in the cavern, right? And it our AI director knows that this is 5 players, right? Then you might actually find that towards the end of that cavern area, right, there is the item you're looking for. But in order to unlock access to it, there's actually 4 individual platforms with switches which must be pushed by 1 player each, right, in order to unlock the final item. Hence, the AI director understands, right? Much like a game master would understand in a D&D game. I have 5 people to work with. This is really interesting. I can give them the challenge to split up, right? And all work towards this one big goal of each pushing the switch at the same time, and then the 5th player taking the item while they're holding down the switches, and then they will have to get out of there before, something else horrible might happen. The cavern might collapse, etc.
Right. And again, second insert here. For legal purposes, Ember Sword is not encouraging you to split your party in D&D. Never do that. It works in Ember Sword, but we're better than D&D.
No, it's very ill-advised.
Yeah.
But there you go. So that kind of gives, I think, a really good impression of sort of what we're doing there when it comes to this generation of quests, rather than just having one fixed set of quest lines where occasionally there's no pelts and poison fangs left for you to collect, and then you just go out there and smash some creatures until you get far enough through the game that you're ready to take on your next pre-scripted adventure. Here we're just we literally call this the adventure finds you. And it's one of our core tenets of the game. And similarly to something that we kind of touched upon in the prior podcast also, is thanks to the fact that we've got these capabilities, right, we can also adjust the loot, the items that you're going to get as part of such a quest, right?
Yeah.
And that is truly great, right? We talked about just a moment about the the Aladdin experience, where don't touch all of this other stuff. You're only here for this item, right? That gets really interesting when our AI game master decides, out of these 4 players that are on this quest, one of them is like, definitely, mostly skilled with a sword. He's got sword gear. I'm going to put this really amazing sword here that he's going to want to have, right? Yet, if he takes it, his whole party is going to be in a hell of a, tough spot. And so you get this really interesting situation evolving where, maybe some really cool reward is offered, even that is a trap, right? But you have the balance of, am I going to put my party first, or am I going to put me first, or is my party okay with the fact that I'm going to, bring down hell upon them just because, because I want that sword. And these kind of things, I think, are super, super interesting to expose players to and kind of see what will happen there. And similarly, of course, with the reward end of things, on the more bright side, not the evil, let's see what happens here side. Obviously at the end of such adventures, because our AI game master designed the adventure for this group of players, it can also be sure that the reward is something that is valuable for all, or at least one of them, right? On a consistent basis.
Yeah.
And these are things that make your game just so much more of a better experience, right? You're less of a victim to randomness that is sort of feast or famine all the time, right? Where, you go on a whole bunch of these, and every time something drops that's useless to you, and then, 3 days in a row, suddenly you're getting everything that's all you. It's more fun if there is more frequently and more reliably something of value for you. And I mean, this from a D&D perspective, right? I mean, it's always so great when you complete the adventure that you're going on, complete that quest, and there is something unique and amazing for everyone that kind of caps off the experience.
That is true. And the D&D campaigns I play, it's mostly emotional trauma in terms of rewards. But I do see what you mean.
All right. Well, be forewarned. If you join any of Svetlin's D&D campaigns, now you know. He's definitely the evil GM that just...
Oh, it's definitely going to be miserable. You're going to have a cow of a time, but don't expect to be able to sleep at night after it.
All right.
So that concludes our podcast on dynamic adventures, and that concludes our 3-part series on AI direction. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you, Loren, for taking the time to school us on these various systems of Ember Sword. And keep it locked. If you have any questions towards us, I'm going to be on the Discord pretty much constantly. That's the Ember Sword Discord, the official one. And should you have any questions, if you want to learn about my D&D trauma, message me there, and I'll reply as best as I can. Hey you made it to the end. Congratulations! That must mean you like us enough to want more, right? Well, good news! We're all over the internet. Go to embersword.com and subscribe to our newsletter for a chance to play the game early, as well as the latest interesting tidbits on the game and the team. Join our lovely Discord community over at discord.gg/embersword. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook at PlayEmberSword for regular updates on what we're up to. And remember the basics. Drink water, be kind to each other, and spread the word about Ember Sword.